Yeah, give me a high sign.
I
Okay.
So if you want us
I'm ready anytime. I'm live now.
Okay, let me.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that little square of bread didn't go very far.
No.
We had what I called the Christ Krispies. I grew up Lutheran, and so it was the little, like the
Yeah, yeah,
gluten
yeah, yeah,
rice
yeah.
wafer
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
The little slice.
It gets stuck and it sticks to the top of your mouth and yeah.
The grape juice isn't enough to get up.
No, no.
No, ours was wine was molded and you had to be very
Oh, you
careful.
must.
Oh dear. Oh dear. Apparently Welch's was Methodist and developed his whole process for but I keep it yeah, yeah.
They had a lot on the Methodists and a lot of other and the Presbyterians and the
Yeah.
Puritans besides. So I wouldn't be surprised.
Linda and I have decided you can start.
All right.
I think, we
Good.
always have a few.
Few who
They,
who wander in, slip in, but that's all good.
more bulletins out at 9:35
Yes.
than I do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. I just want to start by welcoming all of you. Thank you for being here, and especially, of course, we want to welcome our United Methodist missionary, Katherine Parker. And this is her dad, Howard, over here, too, who's also really involved in missionary work and supporting it, so thank you. I also want to say a few other thank yous to Lorna Cruz and the membership team for putting together a lot of refreshments. Please eat lots of cookies. And Rayanne and Corey for being all of our technical support, and Linda Van Pelt and the outreach team for organizing this, bringing Katherine here, and working with Linwood to support Katherine for a long time. And she's going to tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. But I'd just like to invite us into a moment of prayer. Loving one, we thank you for the gift of another day and for this time to come together and learn. We pray the spirit of your blessing would be upon us and on Katherine, that you would open our hearts and our minds to hear stories and to learn more about the people of Nepal and the ministry there, the needs that they have, and how we can support them as brothers and sisters in the family of God. We thank you for Katherine, the gifts that she brings, and we pray your spirit of blessing would be with her tonight and as she journeys back to Nepal. Amen. I'm going to invite Linda to come up, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about our connection.
And just to second what Jen said about membership, thank you, but also outreach members who made cookies and goodies, thank you too. We appreciate it. We should send you both home with a nice goodie bag. Got plenty. We have supported Katherine Parker in her missionary work since 2008. She began as a missionary in Cambodia in 2007, and she will share that with you. But I just wanted you to know how long this church has, and it's been every year that we have done this. And Katherine also, let me see if I can find this page. This is our very first Linwood Alternative Giving program that we made, and we did that in 2010. And there is Katherine Parker. And she has also been in every single one of our alternative giving catalogs since 2010. So you can see it's been a long-standing friendship. And years ago, we also used to, BC, before COVID, we used to knit. We had a knitting group who knit the tiny little baby caps, and we would have 100, 150, and she would take them with her And we haven't done that for well, again, since BC. So maybe we'll be able to do that again. We can try. But we are just so appreciative of you taking the time, because you haven't been here since 2019. There's a lot of churches that want to talk with you, a lot of people that want to hear what you have to say. So thank you, and your dad, your agent, your roadie for putting all of this together for us. And I'm going to be quiet now and let you talk.
Thank you, Linda. This is great. I'm so excited to be back here again with all of you at Linwood United Methodist Church. I've come before on a Sunday morning, and that's wonderful, and I love being able to be with the whole congregation. But for me, these times when we can have a little bit more in-depth conversation, go a little bit deeper into the ministry, and have some conversation together is really a joy for me. And so I'm so excited to all of you who've come out on this lovely Friday evening, and to everyone who's joining us online as well. It is really, really a pleasure for me to be back in person with all of you. You are one of my very first supporting congregations who have been with me since I came into service, first, as you heard, in Cambodia, and now for the last 10 years in Nepal. So it's so exciting to be able to bring you a little bit of an update. I'll share with you a little bit about some of the impacts of COVID, but also focus on our work in climate justice, in disability inclusion, and in gender equality, as I share with you about the ministry that we as the United Methodist Church get to be part of in the ecumenical work of the United Mission to Nepal, UMN. I am so excited to be part of this amazing ecumenical work. We as Methodists helped to found this work almost 70 years ago. Some of that history is that we used to have some Methodist missionaries by the name of the Flemings, Robert and Bethel Fleming, working in North India. This was at a time when Nepal was still a very closed country, an isolated country. But before I get too far into that story, we might want to remember where in the world is Nepal. And I've got a map on the next slide. And in the upper, well, let's see, upper left-hand corner, you might see a globe up there. It looks a little different because it is on the other side of the world from where we are here. Nepal is pretty much exactly on the other side of the globe. You can go either direction. And there's a little tiny green pickle-shaped country just north of India, south of China, south of Tibet, that is Nepal. Now, most people, when they think of Nepal, they think about the big tall mountains, right? Mount Everest. Well, Nepal is a very diverse country. It's about 1/4 the size of California geographically, but it has almost as many people. 32 million people live in Nepal. And 60% of them live in the lowlands, what we call the Terai, which is in green on that topographical map at the bottom. That starts just above sea level and goes to about 3,000 feet elevation. But Nepal very quickly starts to go uphill, and that brown and yellow section that runs through the middle of the country is called the Pahad, the Middle Hills. 30% of the population lives there between 3,000 and 6,000 feet elevation. Kathmandu Valley, which is on the eastern side of the country, is at 4,500 feet. That's where I live today. But there's another place, if you kind of keep going west, that's a sort of purple color on the political map up there, that's Rukam. We've got a fellow here from Rukam. That's where I lived for about 4 years, and that's where I was when I spoke to you back in 2019. But if you keep going up from that, you do have villages that I've worked in at 9,000 feet. I visited villages at 12 and 14,000 feet. And 10% of the population does live in that northern strip, that white strip there that's called the Himal zone. Himal means snowy mountain in the Nepali language. So the Himalayas, those are just the snowy mountains. But because Nepal is at the latitude of southern Florida, the snow doesn't really stick until about 10,000 feet. So that's why you have villages that are living up at those elevations. Obviously, nobody lives at 26,000 feet at the top of Mount Everest. But you do have quite a range, and you've got all of these hills and valleys. And so there's a lot of diversity in Nepal, not just climate diversity, right? You've got the lowlands where it's hot and humid, whereas you've got more temperate zones as you go up into elevation. But you've also got a lot of ethnic and linguistic and religious and political diversity. There are 126 different languages that are tracked on the census. 12 major ethnic groups. And so you can see some of that diversity in some of the posters here. We've got Sunita here from Kapilvastu, which is in the lowlands. You've got Poonam over there, who's from Mugu, which is in the Himal zone. And Janak here is from the Middle Hills. So you can start to see some of the diversity that exists within Nepal. As I was mentioning, 70 years ago when United Mission to Nepal was founded, Nepal was a closed country. And that happened actually almost 350 years ago when Nepal was unified under the monarchy. It started to isolate itself. Hardly anyone went out. Folks didn't come in. But that did start to change in the late 1940s when the then King of Nepal left on a diplomatic mission to India, and more Nepalis started to leave the country. They went to places like Darjeeling in northeast India and other places along the border to work as migrants. And in those spaces outside of Nepal, they encountered Christ, and their lives were changed. And so it was Nepali migrant workers coming back to their home country who were the first ones to bring the good news of God in Christ and form Christian communities. I had the privilege of working with Nalom Rongong for several years in our adolescent sexual reproductive health program. Her great uncle, Dr. Rongong, was one of those whose family moved to northeast India. And in his early 20s, he came back to his hometown in Kathmandu to help found one of the first Christian churches there. And so the church in Nepal is a self-evangelized church. It's a self-governing church, a self-theologizing church. And even at a time when conversion was illegal in Nepal, which was the case until the end of the Civil War, the Spirit was moving among the Nepali people and calling some into a relationship together through God in Christ. Around that same time, a little bit after Dr. Rongong came back to Kathmandu, there were some doors that were opening for the global Christian community to also be part of this work. As I mentioned, some of those doors opened because of these Methodist missionaries, Robert and Bethel Fleming. Robert was an ornithologist, a bird scientist. His wife Bethel, a medical doctor. And Robert got permission from the then King of Nepal to come into the country on a bird collecting expedition. He brought another medical doctor friend of his, and they treated people as he went around collecting bird samples, eventually wrote the premier bird guide to the region. At the end of that trip, they stopped in Kathmandu to thank the king for permission to come into the country and said, hey, could we come back and start a couple hospitals, do some education work? The king said, yes, but I don't want all you Christians coming in here wiggly-piggledy with all your different denominations causing confusion. You need to come in under one umbrella. And so we did. We got together with 7 different denominations, 7 different denominational mission agencies to form what was on the previous slide, the organization that I now work for called the United Mission to Nepal. Can we go back one slide? Yeah. Oh. There we go, yes. The United Mission to Nepal has this beautiful vision, a vision of fullness of life for all in a transformed Nepali society. I love this vision, right? The John 10:10 promise that is embedded there, life in all its abundance. Nowadays, we have almost 35 different denominational partners from Finland to Hong Kong and New Zealand, all the way around here to the United States. But even in this ecumenical realm that we're working, you might hear some Methodist influence going on, because our Methodist mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Hold on to that word transformation. I hope that you'll listen for that experience of transformation in the stories I have to share with you. This mission that we've been engaged in for almost 70 years is one that is inspired by the love and teachings of Jesus Christ. It is in partnership with the Christian community and others in Nepal, those churches that have formed in Nepal. We work together with them, as well as the community worldwide, all of you, as we serve the people of Nepal, especially those who live in poverty, to pursue peace and justice for all, to address the root causes of poverty, and to make Christ known by word and life. And we do that by engaging in a process of community transformation, which starts in our next slide here, that looks at what is fullness of life. How do we move from a life of poverty into that promise that Jesus offers? And one of the first things that we think about is that a life of poverty is more than just economic lack. What are the broken relationships, right, between our families, or between religious or caste or ethnic or political divides? Are there broken relationships around users of shared ecosystem services, right, our watersheds, our forests? How do those keep us locked out of God's promise? And so our first step as organizers is in the next slide. We sit around in a community, kind of like we do on Sunday mornings, and we cast a vision. What does fullness of life look like for us specifically? Because that's going to be different here in Pleasanton than it is down in Turlock, where I was last week, or it's going to be in Healdsburg, where I'll be on Sunday. It's different up in the high Himals of Mugu than it is in the lowlands of Kapilvastu. And so we want to sit together as a community to cast that vision and to identify the barriers that are keeping us from achieving that as we become the community in action together. As a parachurch organization, as a registered international non-governmental organization in Nepal, a lot of these visions that we help communities to cast end up being worked out through grants. So UMCOR, other church partners provide grants to us that help us to do work in education, in health, both mental health and maternal and child health, in sustainable livelihoods, in peace building, things like cross-border trafficking, in good governance. In all of these areas, we work with communities to live out their vision. This picture is, last picture, if we go back one. Yeah, this picture here is one of an education program out in Rukum that I was part of. This is a child-to-child teaching and learning project. So this young lady, about age 13, has prepared a lesson plan, probably in hygiene, and she's teaching it to her peers. Other youth groups will do things in child marriage or in extracurricular activities like Poonam has done. We got great reports from this community that during COVID, these young leaders were out doing street drama on hand washing with soap. So they're really getting active and becoming leaders in their community. But no matter whether we're looking at an education or a health or a peace-building project, there's a couple of areas that we call our cross-cutting issues. These are issues that we think are so important that every single community group needs to be talking about them. And so that's what I want to share with you tonight. And the first of those is here, our area of creation care, care for God's creation or climate justice work. This is another picture from a village called Kadi out in Rukum, where I was working for 4 years. And this is a youth group that have gotten together for some community action in a very remote place. Kadi is kind of challenging to get to. First of all, of course, you got to get to Nepal. So it's about 22 hours in the air, no matter which way you go, at least 2 flights to get you to Kathmandu. Once you're there in Kathmandu, it's about 24 hours to drive to Rukam district, 2 to 3 days. So when I was living out there, if I was lucky, I'd get the once-a-week flight. It was in a twin otter plane, so 2 propellers, 15 seats. Has to be a short plane because it's a short runway at the top of the ridge there. And if the plane doesn't stop, which it always did for me, thankfully, that gets you to the district headquarters of Musikot. Then we get in an off-road Jeep and head up into the hills. This is not your SUV, right? This is a rough vehicle, and I've traveled in those Jeeps for 8, 9, 10 hours on those mountain roads. Cadiz Road, well, when I was there, it usually ran out after about 3 to 4 hours in the Jeep. There'd be a landslide or there'd be ice on the 11,000-foot pass, so we had to get out and start walking. These young people could make it up and over the pass in about 6 hours. I'm a little slower. I was more like 9, 10 hours to get out there. But once they're out there, these young people have organized a community cleanup day. They are getting the single-use plastics out of the irrigation canal that runs through their community town. Because even out in this remote area, folks like to have their ramen noodles. They like their sweets, their little snackety snacks that come wrapped in plastic. And if you're used to biodegradable wrappings, right, you might not recognize what would happen if your plastic blows away. Then again, how many of us know what happens when we put our plastic into the trash can, right? Magically, once a week, the truck comes and takes it away to somewhere called the dump. So while these youth are also engaged in a community cleanup, they're doing community education around how do we manage our resources? How do we manage our environment? Do we designate a special place for burial of trash? Do we build an incinerator so that we have more appropriate means of burning our trash if that's the route we take? These are the kinds of conversations that these young people are leading. I've got a video which we can go ahead and get started. It's of the lowlands. No, go ahead. Yeah, it's there in the lowlands looking at some of this same work.
Kapilvastu, one of the major rice-producing districts of Nepal. Agriculture is predominantly rain-fed during the monsoon, and during the dry spells, the farmers depend on the rainwater collected in the ponds.
Monsoon rain is the lifeline of farmers. It affects the ecosystem and the food security of local people.
As you can see, there is this beautiful pond right behind us. It's clean, well-maintained, and thriving with life. My friend Nelson was telling me that they've even started fish farming, is that right?
Yeah,
And what's interesting is, a few years ago, the story was different. How was this pond?
it was dry, dirty, and almost like a dumping site. It was a critical environmental issue.
A lot of work was put to restore not just this, but 8 such ponds in Kapilvastu district.
कपिलवस्तु जिल्लाको यस यशोधरा गाउँपालिका अति नै सुखद
Kapilvastu, which is a district which is dry and prone to drought. So to combat that, the local ancestors had dug many ponds around the district to collect rainwater.
र जसलाई विशेष गरी सिंचाइ
And this rainwater was used for irrigation and the cattle.
पोखरी
Decades later, due to siltation and lack of community governance, the pond started to shrink and become a garbage pit. Earlier, people threw garbage here. It looks so beautiful now. Firstly, to motivate the community people, we got involved in a lot of awareness raising activities around climate change. Gradually, the community were encouraged and got to work.
Water recharge. Increased irrigated area by harvesting rainwater. Preparing paddy nursery bed during water-stressed period. Kitchen gardening, contributing to family nutrition. Fish farming.
Ponds are a community resource that every villager has the right to use and enjoy. United Mission to Nepal is happy to have been a part of this important pond restoration project.
So this work in climate justice is really important for us because Nepal is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. If, as a global community, we manage to keep our average temperature increase to just 2 degrees Celsius, which was the global pledge in the Paris Climate Accords, that means Nepal is going to experience a 4-degree rise in its temperatures. And so that's already leading to increased melt of the glaciers and the permanent snowpack, so less water recharge, more drought in the highlands. This year again, we're having severe flooding in parts of the lowlands. But the biggest challenge is really, I think, the variability in the start and stop of the monsoon rains. You heard Roop talk, our team leader Roop talk about how monsoon rain is the lifeline of farmers. And 65% of Nepal's population is engaged in subsistence level agriculture. And so the variability in when the rains come, how long they're going to last, this has a huge impact on food security, the ability of these farmers to support themselves and their families. And so this kind of work, as we engage with the youth, with the farmers, with others in talking about climate change, in thinking about how we manage our resources collectively, looking at our traditional practices like ponds. How can we dig them deeper, adapt those so that they're better able to sustain us through the dry periods? Or can they help to mitigate against when the rains are going to start and stop? All of these are ways that as we engage in this dialogue together, we're able to address these challenges. This is the obligatory goat picture. Goats are very important in Nepal. And the next picture has a lady bringing home some lovely green leaves for her goats to eat. Sometimes people ask me what we eat in Nepal. And of course, as a crossroads, Nepal's cuisine is influenced both by India, by South Asia, as well as by China and East Asian cuisine, and there's a mixture of that. But our typical morning and evening meal would be dal bhat, dal being lentils, bhat being rice, some curried vegetables, sometimes some curried goat, and some cooked greens, which we call sag. Usually those are mustard greens, but there's a wide variety of green leafy vegetables that we can eat in Nepal. And one of them comes from a plant called the sisnu plant. That's its Nepali name. I'm not going to tell you what it is in English because there's going to be a quiz. We eat the green leaves from this plant, but you can also take the stalks and dry them and card them and spin that into a yarn which can be woven into this fabric. Now, this plant also grows here in California. I even met a lady up in Wenatchee, Washington, who has done this weaving herself. So some of you might have gotten the story that talks about this, but I'll pass this around and we'll see if anybody can guess what it is. If you want to cheat, you can look for the weaving story, but we'll come back to that a little bit later as well. The second area that's our cross-cutting area that I want to share about is in the next slide, is the area of disability inclusion. We know that people with a disability all around the world face discrimination, they face exclusion, they face challenges to fully participate in the life of the community. And so we work to make sure that all of our project activities are accessible and that people with disabilities are welcomed in. I talked about that process of community visioning that we do, right? Obviously, if you call the political leaders and the powerful people in the community together, they've got their vision already. They're ready to tell you what that is. But we want to make sure that we emphasize the voices of women and children and Dalits, the so-called untouchable caste, as well as people with a disability in that vision casting process. And so we also work on areas of access to education, access to health care, overcoming some of the stigma and the superstitions that might lead people to think that a disability is a curse on the individual or their family, as well as working directly with people with a disability on their own daily living needs, such as putting in wheelchair accessible toilets, helping to make sure that people can get in and out of their houses so they have a good area. I mean, these are the kinds of things that many of our youth who go on Sierra Service Project, they get involved in this kind of work right here in this country as well. Because our staff are working in some very remote communities like Kadi Village, they are often among the first to identify a child with a disability. And so we help children like Bishnu, who you see on the right-hand side there, to come to get transportation into one of the regional hospitals where she can get a proper diagnosis. She's been diagnosed with a form of cerebral palsy, and then help her with her physiotherapy, get leg braces, that rattan walker, other assistive devices to help her engage in the community. So the next video is one about another young man named Amit and his life and how we have seen him begin to flourish.
Today we are visiting Amit Yadav's house in Kapilvastu. Amit's story is a story of real joy and success.
Amit is my firstborn, and he is 9 years old.
For the first 2 years of Amit's life, he was bedridden. He couldn't move his limbs or crawl like other babies his age.
I used to get sad when I saw other children Amit's age walking and moving around. My son couldn't even sit up.
Little Amit was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. The doctors told the parents that they could not predict if Amit would walk, talk, or live independently. The biggest change came when a UMN staff met this family, counseled them, and started him off on therapy sessions. He is blessed with a very loving and supportive family. His grandfather especially kept pushing him through all challenges and helped him with the therapy every day. There were times when the family was fearful and uncertain, but what kept them going was their love for Amit.
When my child was sick, I used to feel scared and anxious. It was hurtful when the villagers said mean things about his situation.
With successful therapy results, Amit's life has changed forever. Look at him today. Like most boys his age, he longed to have a bicycle. His loving grandfather has all the time to give him cycling lessons. This might not seem like a huge accomplishment, but to see him cycle has brought such joy and pride in the family.
He used to just lie down. He is cycling now. Amit wears blue pants and shirt to school. I was really happy and proud to see Amit go to school in his uniform. We should never look down on people living with disability. Anyone can have it. I was so delighted when he started going to school.
Before we leave and say goodbye, Amit dances for us. He loves to dance. Every child is on their own unique path to success, and so is Amit.
It's so much fun to see Amit thriving, to see his parents, his grandparents feel confident to support him, and to see his life in this way. My job responsibilities have changed over the 10 years that I have been in Nepal. My current title is Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability, and Learning Advisor, which is a mouthful, so I say I'm part of the meal team. But as part of that, I get to go and I get to visit our different field offices and meet with our project staff as we set up monitoring structures, as we do evaluations. And last year I was down in Nawalparasi, another lowland area near to where Amit lives, to do an evaluation of the Integrated Community Health Project. That's a project looking primarily at maternal and child health, so getting women in for their 4 prenatal checkups, promoting institutional delivery, trying to reduce birth injury, which is one of the causes of cerebral palsy, as well as looking at things like family planning and working with people with a disability. I'm always tickled when I see Amit ride his bicycle, because one of the young men that I interviewed, probably in his mid-20s, he also, like Amit, has a mobility disability. But also, like Amit, he can ride a bicycle. And so he's developed a small business. He goes around his village and the next village over fixing zippers and selling hair ties. And as part of the project, we were able to help him get an electric bicycle. And so now he's expanded his territory. He's got about 6 villages that he can reach. And he is so proud of being able to not only support his family, but being seen as a productive member of society. Another evaluation I was part of last year was for our community-based rehabilitation for people with disabilities. That's run out of our hospital in Okaldunga. We have actually started 7 hospitals over the years. 5 of those are now community hospitals. One of those community hospitals is Patton, which is in the Kathmandu Valley. It's a 700-bed hospital that was started by Bethel Fleming. It was identified as one of the primary COVID response hospitals during the COVID pandemic. Now, Nepal actually had very few cases of COVID during the first year because it had this incredibly strict border closure, closed its airport for 7 months, didn't let its own citizens its own citizens back in for about 3 months. And so that did limit the transmission of COVID in the first year of the pandemic, while hospitals were slowly starting to get their protocols in place and get enough PPEs and really build up those systems. We're very grateful that our hospital in Tan Sen had just built an oxygen concentrator plant at the hospital, because previous to that, they had to drive 2 hours down the hill to Butwal to fill up their oxygen canisters and bring them back up. And so while there were hospitals who, especially private hospitals, who were turning people away, maybe you tested positive for COVID and yet you're about to deliver, our hospital never turned anyone away. We were always able to manage even COVID positive people within that hospital system. We have some missionaries, Mark and Deirdre Zimmerman. Deirdre is a nutritionist. Mark is a physician. Mark ran the COVID ward at Patton Hospital for the 6 months that included the Delta wave. And that was the first really big wave that hit Nepal in a very severe way, in such a way that it did overwhelm the hospitals there. Mark told stories about how there's only one oxygen concentrator plant for the entire Kathmandu Valley. So all the hospitals send their canisters to that plant and then collect them back. And there was a period there where they were running out of oxygen, about a week, that they couldn't get the canisters filled in time. And so there'd be these 10, 15-minute breaks in bringing the oxygen in. Eventually they did, after about a week of that, they did get some liquid oxygen tanks in, and so they were able to use that to supplement the oxygen concentrator plants. But some very, very challenging times there. So while the death rates in Nepal were, in terms of percentage of the population, not what they were here, it certainly was still enough to overwhelm the medical system in Nepal. At the same time, I'm really excited that because of some of the resources that have come into Nepal during COVID, we now have more supplies of things like bedside concentrators out in rural areas. Because just a few years ago, acute respiratory infection, pneumonia, eclipsed dysentery as the #1 killer of children under 5. And so while the pandemic globally has been declared over, right? COVID is still around, even though the pandemic is going on, is ended. But those sorts of issues, like acute respiratory infections in children, are still an issue in Nepal in many of the rural areas where people are cooking over open fires and those sorts of situations. And so the quality improvements that we've made, especially in some of our more remote hospitals and clinics, I hope will start to see some impact on our ability to treat some of those diseases as well. So that was just a little COVID aside here, but back to being out in Okhaldunga Hospital, which is an 80-bed hospital that we run about 10 hours east of Kathmandu. As part of both our community work and as part of our hospitals, we have physiotherapists who are on staff. And when I was out in Okhaldunga, I went around with our physiotherapists. They will walk village to village, house to house, to meet with families like Amit's, to help train parents and caregivers on how to support their family member with physiotherapy activities, setting up assistive devices, other ways to support people in their activities of daily living. Along with that, the project also organizes self-reliance groups of people with a disability and their family members looking to build community and also to do that kind of education and outreach that I was talking about. One of the folks that we met in our interviews for that was a man, I'm guessing in his mid-30s, because he has an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old child. He had been blind since birth. He also had a small business. He was weaving baskets. His wife would pick the colors for him, and he would weave the baskets, and he could support his family that way. But what I learned is that his story was that what had changed the most for him since the project started organizing groups and engaging in outreach was that he shared that for last year, for the first time ever, he was invited as a featured musician for the community festival. He was welcomed, included. And this is what we talk about when we say God's kingdom is here. God, you are all welcome to be part of it. Even though Christians are only 1% to 2% of the population in Nepal, we are salt and light among the community. And when we can model that kind of welcome, that is a spark where we start to recognize and celebrate all of the gifts that we have to offer to each other in community. And so I'm so excited by these kinds of times of transformation. The final area story, and I know I'm going way over time today, but I hope you'll stick with me for one more story around our work in gender equality. But in order to describe the status and role of women in Nepal, I need to take a step back and talk about some of the legal structures in Nepal as well as the economics. Now, I mentioned Nepal was a monarchy. It was a Hindu theocracy until the end of the Civil War in the early 2000s, which ousted the monarchy. Democracy came in 2015. Nepal ratified a constitution. Yay! But democracy isn't easy, right? It's taken a lot of time to kind of figure that out. Laws continue to change. And as we know, laws can change, but there's still a lot of social norms, right, that are often based on some of those laws that take time as well. And so those still have some implications in Nepal today. But first, economics. So when you think Nepal, right, you think those big mountain climbers, the expedition climbers who go up Everest and the 8,000-meter peaks. And those are important because tourism is important for Nepal. 25% of Nepal's GDP comes from tourism. And I'm not just talking about the expedition climbers, right? Those who come and walk up to base camp, they're important. You don't even have to climb mountains. Come and sit in Pokhara and look at the mountains. They're spectacular. Maybe you don't like mountains. Come to the lowlands, see the elephants, see the crocodiles. They have these funny, long, thin-nosed crocodiles. I think they're delightful. Tourism, very important. But even more important than tourism is remittance, foreign workers sending money home. 35% of Nepal's GDP comes from remittance. Now, there are countries in the world that have a higher dollar amount of remittance that come in, but in terms of percentage of the GDP, Nepal is the highest in the world. And so 60% of Nepal's economy is based on the movement of people, tourists coming in, foreign workers going out. So COVID also had a big hit on Nepal in that regard. Within the migrant community, there is a hierarchy of different kinds of migrant work that people do. And the lowest status migrant workers are those seasonal migrant workers who go to India. Maybe you get the field planted, you go down a couple months, you come back in time for harvest, you might go down again, you come back, you might earn about $100 equivalent in profits, doing construction, road building, women working in domestic service. These are very challenging jobs. They're very vulnerable to both labor and sexual exploitation. But those profits that you're making, they're important. That uniform that Amit's mother was so proud of him wearing, that costs $7 to $10. You need oil, you need salt, you might need medical care. And so those are important earnings for your family, especially for subsistence level farmers. So we do a lot of work with this level of migrant worker. In the picture you see we've got a financial literacy class going on, helping to set up savings groups, helping to talk about that. We also do a lot of work in small business development, starting up dry goods shops, expanding your farm with something like beekeeping, or maybe a technical skill like machine working or tailoring. Because it doesn't take much profits from a small business to make that more viable than this very vulnerable seasonal migrant work. A step up from that is those who go to the Gulf countries on labor contracts. They'll go for 2, 3, 5 years, primarily in construction. If you heard about any of the human rights violations going on around building the World Cup soccer stadiums, that very much impacted Nepalis. There was a period there where we were seeing a coffin a day being returned to the Kathmandu airport. Very challenging work. A step up from that is factory work, predominantly in Malaysia or in Korea. These are long, challenging terms, a lot of family separation that's involved in this kind of work. But if you go on one of these labor contracts, you can earn enough to build a house for your family, get some stability, have a safe place. The most prestigious of the foreign work for Nepalis is military service. So those who go to work as police in Singapore or as Gurkhas in the British Army. But all of this work is difficult and dangerous. And yet, it's an incredibly important part of the economy. And so there's great drive to be part of that. Now, Nepal is still an arranged marriage society. So if you're around about ready to send your young son off to work on one of these labor contracts for several years, you want to make sure that he is grounded, that he feels connected to the family and has a sense of being needed and supported. And so what better time to arrange a marriage than just before he heads out? Now, in Nepal, as a woman, when you get married, you leave your maitigar, your mother's house, and you become part of your husband's family. And that has been built into the legal structure of Nepal. So, I best explain that by talking about land tenure. Traditionally in Nepal, they only allowed one name on the title deed for a piece of land. Now, about 5-6 years ago, that changed. They now have joint land ownership, and we have big campaigns now to encourage families to put both their husband and wife's name on the title deed, but that's slow. So for 90% of the land in Nepal, whose name is on the land title? The husband's name. And Nepal's inheritance laws are also different from what our laws are here in California. Of course, it's state by state, but California has laws that say when a spouse dies, the property would be divided half to the spouse and half to the children. Not so in Nepal. In Nepal, when the landowner dies, when the husband dies, the land is divided equally among his sons, because it's assumed that the daughter inherits with her husband. Actually, that's not quite right. It's equally among his sons and any unmarried daughter over the age of 35, because, of course, at 35... Well, that law has changed. Now sons and daughters inherit equally in Nepal, which is great. But wait, what about the wife? What about the widow? She is not included in that legal structure. And so traditionally it is assumed that her sons would take care of her when her spouse dies. Well, that leads to a whole range of thinking, right? Because if you know that in your old age you're going to require your son to take care of you, and your children are there, and tonight you have a little bit of meat, who's going to get that chicken leg, that little extra bit of meat to eat tonight? Your kids have come home from school. Both your son and your daughter went to school. That's great. They both studied. They're both home now. But which one is going to get to sit and do their homework? And which one's going to have to go to the water tap and carry back a jug of water? So this legal structure reinforces some of the social norms that we call son preference in child rearing. And so even as these laws are changing, we're still talking in our community groups about what does it mean to treat your children, your daughters and your sons equally. We're talking about the impacts of family separation during these long migrations, right? How is your relationship with your in-laws when your husband is far away? How do you reunify your family when your spouse comes back after a long contract? And so it's not surprising that Nepal has one of the highest rates of suicide among women of reproductive age. So we're not just talking about this in terms of family dynamics, but as in the next slide, we're also looking at this from a mental health perspective. This is one of our staff doing a training for the female community health volunteers to get the word out that mental illness is treatable. You can come into the health facility, to the clinic, the health post that serves about 8,000 to 10,000 people, and we work training the health assistant who runs that in how to refer people with severe mental illness, how to prescribe the 2 psychotropic drugs that are available free through the formulary, the free government medicines, to get that possibility out there. So I have one last video for you which looks at some of these dynamics within one family. So we can go ahead and show that.
Married at a young age of 20, Punita Sahani's typical day starts at 4 a.m. with house chores. In her free time, she enjoys weaving colorful takia, a local basket. After marriage, her husband soon took off to Malaysia for work. After 2 years, he came back for good, but he soon started beating her and throwing things around. Punita suffered from domestic violence for around 6 months but never fought back. It was embarrassing. What would the neighbors say? She began to blame herself for the frequent fights at home. Her parents even asked her to get separated, but she loved him enough to stay back. UMN's partner formed a women's group in her village. Punita was able to join the group despite her husband being reluctant in the beginning. It was also compulsory for the women group members' husbands to join the men's group. Punita started gaining knowledge and confidence in life from the group discussions on various social issues. She even told her husband that she would bring the group home if he continued beating her. After her husband received gender training, there was a gradual change in his behavior. Firstly, he cut off on his alcohol intake and also stopped beating his wife. Surprisingly, he also began helping her with the cooking. Looking back, Punita feels that she would continue suffering in life if her husband hadn't changed. Her husband is a different person now. He regrets his bad behaviors of the past. It was the gender training he received from UMN that made him change his ways. They have moved on in life as a happy couple with plans and dreams for the future.
So obviously it's more complicated than you can share in a 2-minute video. But you start to get some of the picture, right? The family separation, the complications around that, but also some of the healing process as well. The importance of the community standing together with that vision. When we were doing some of this work and I was out in Rukum, we had a woman disclose to the group that she was experiencing violence at home. And not only was her husband hitting her, but the children were mimicking that behavior as well. And when she first disclosed this to the community, their response was, that's normal, happens to everybody. But you didn't hear that from Benita's group. They said, no, this isn't normal. This isn't the vision we have of fullness of life, and we will stand with you. These changes aren't easy. They take time, they take deep conversations. We have amazing social mobilizers. They'll use cards, pictures like this, and say, who's gonna win this race? How do we equalize the burden? Does this look like something you've experienced or something you've seen in your community? And as those conversations go on, we start to realize that we're not alone, that we can stand together. And this is who we are as the church, right? As we gather together every Sunday, as we listen to the stories of our faith, as we share the stories of our community, we recognize that we are not alone and that God has this great vision for us. So we can come together to transform the world. So thanks for being the church. Thanks for being the church that is engaged here in Pleasanton in all the ways that you are active. And thanks for being the church that's connected to our siblings in Christ in Nepal and all around the world, as together we live into that great promise that Jesus has given us, that life in all its abundance is here among us. Praise be to God. Yes, there was the fabric that came round. Any guesses? Yes. Good guess, good guess. No, we do eat the green leaves, so hopefully, I know people here do as well, but no, this is a regularly consumed green leafy vegetable in Nepal. Of course, mostly you wouldn't eat them here. Most people here would just make a tea out of it if they did that. There's one clue. Another clue is that they are often picked on the way home because they grow in disturbed areas and you have to use tongs to pick them. Close, close. It's like thistle. It has a little stinger on it. Not dandelion. You're almost there. Absolutely right. Yay! I think you're only the third person that I have had who's been able to actually guess it, so congratulations. Well, see, that's how you know what's going on out there in the fields. Yes, so sisnu is a nettle, a stinging nettle that we do eat the green leaves in Nepal, but it also has many other purposes like weaving fabric. I'd love to continue this in conversation. If you have questions, or if you have thoughts, or if you have reflections on parallels you've seen in your community, yes.